Russia's Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, says he's going to allow protesters to hold a very large rally in Moscow on Christmas Eve. It's a bold step from the man who wants to regain the presidency next March, but whose United Russia party saw its vote fall below 50% at recent Duma elections. So, have we all overrated Putin? Welcome to Agenda with George Friedman, and joining us also our chief Eurasia analyst Lauren Goodrich. Now, in the new year, Vladimir Putin and the United Russia Party will be campaigning for Putin's bid to retake the presidency. How do you expect them to adjust their strategy to take account of this recent challenge to Putin's political monopoly?
Well, Putin is going to have to address the protesters. And what the protesters are looking for is for the middle class to actually be heard for the first time in Russia, which they've never had a voice. They've never had a leader, and they've never had anyone to represent them in the government. And so Putin at first is going to have to go to the protesters themselves. And then there will have to be some structural changes within the party systems.
I think the more interesting question here is, has the narrative on Vladimir Putin been right? There's been an assumption here that Putin could decide whether or not he or Medvedev would run, that he was certainly going to win if he ran. I'm not really interested in the demonstrations nearly as much as I am in the electoral results. Rather than being preeminently dominant over the electorate, Putin didn't do very well. There are a bunch of theories out there on how Putin planned not to do so well. And, this is really a brilliant strategy showing that it's really a democratic society and he's in complete control. The other explanation is he really isn't as popular as we thought. And so we at Stratfor have been talking about Putin as a preeminent force, and I begin to wonder whether we have to re-examine that. He may be weaker than he appears. Demonstrations always get a lot of attention, and everybody focuses on, transcendental meaning to that. Now let's look at the numbers in that election.
Well, the numbers in the election is what is really interesting, because the parties that rose and took United Russia's seats in parliament, they're the nationalist parties. They're the ones that are Russia for Russians. They want Putin to take a harder stand in the country, a more nationalistic stand inside the country. And so that's the communists and the liberal Democrats who did better. The other interesting thing is that among the minorities in Russia, especially in the Caucasus, United Russia took almost all the votes among minorities. It was the Russian population that decided to vote for the nationalists instead.
And then leaving out, the question of Putin, the personality, you're seeing a split developing, a serious split between the Russian population, non-Russian population. Mm-hmm. And this may well presage some serious tensions. Mm-hmm. But certainly it seems to indicate that Russia is far less united than Russia United would like to think. And Putin's position is not so obviously paramount. And without Putin, this regime looks very different. So all I'm saying is that I was brought up short by the numbers. They weren't what I expected. Granted, we can say that it's a movement to the right rather than to the left. I'm not sure that any of us should, be comforted by that.
But that's the difference, is that the election results show a swing towards nationalism versus the protests, which they weren't nationalist protests. Well, and so they're two separate issues.
Protests are held by whoever decides to show up. I mean, we in the West have this obsession with assigning excessive significance to demonstrations. Demonstrations happen, people come out and demonstrate. It doesn't show much. The elections, which were pretty much fair, people said, mm-hmm. some were. The election showed us something very different. So what we learned is that the demonstrators were from the left and the electorate was moving to the right.
How seriously should we take the statement by Mikhail Prokhorov that he'll run against Putin? Could this just be a ruse?
Well, what I find most interesting about Prokhorov's announcement is what happened right before the announcement. A few days before Prokhorov made his announcement, Vladislav Surkov, who is Putin's right hand, made a very public speech, which he doesn't do very often. And in that speech, he said that Russia needs a new political player in order to be in front of the middle class and also to represent big business inside of Russia. And then all of a sudden, 2 days later, you have Prokhorov make his announcement.
The problem of this announcement was that it looked more like an attempt by somebody not necessarily violently opposed to Putin to preempt the space that was opening up. That where the space is there on the right, as you said, and no right-wing personality has really emerged to really challenge from that. This was an attempt to show an opposition. So it may have been a response to the election. So you could both say that Prokhorov is not a particularly significant player in this, but that Putin has some serious problems anyway.
But if we're looking at a swing to nationalism, and then the West has created this narrative that Putin is losing power inside of Russia, whereas the polling numbers even going into the elections are exactly the results that happened. So anyone actually looking at the numbers would have seen that this was going to be the result, except the West has spun the narrative in a different way. Bringing Prokhorov into the narrative is very interesting because he is very pro-Western. He is liked in the West. He's bigger than life here in the West. And so it kind of is a red herring to divert the West's attention to Prokhorov instead of actually looking at what happened in the polling numbers.
Look, can I now move you on to the issue of corruption? More times than I think I can remember, I've seen the expression, a party of crooks and thieves, ascribed to this United Russia party. And there's been quite a lot published in respectable newspapers like the London Financial Times about crony capitalism and well-rewarded oligarchs from St. Petersburg known to be close to Putin.
Well, in the first place, and it's really interesting that the Financial Times discovered crony capitalism in Russia, as if this was something new. This is the way Russia works. In part, it works this way because of the way it privatized, and in part it works this way because Western interests were involved in that privatization. So this is Russia. It is not Britain. It is not Australia. And I'm glad the Financial Times realized that. The problem that you have here is, however, that whatever comes out will be somehow linked to crony capitalism. But what is the ideology that it represents? I think what Lauren has pointed out, which I think is very important, is that unlike previous the expectations, which has always been that Putin is the hard right guy, and off in the wilderness is the guy in the white suit who's really nice, liberal, and a Minnesota Democrat. What we really find here is that what the opposition looks like is communist and nationalist and much stronger than anyone would have thought of. The crony capitalism issue is not the issue on the table this day. What appears to be at issue is Putin or something to the right of him, and not at all what we would have expected or wanted in the West, which is someone more like us.
So there's a split narrative going on of what the West is saying versus what is actually happening on the ground.
And that split is always there because the interesting thing of the past few years is the West is constantly inventing liberalizing movements. Whether it's the Arab Spring or uprisings in Thailand, somewhere in the world there is a liberalizing movement. The ability to get your arms around the idea that in many of these demonstrations and risings you're not seeing liberalization, but a hard line element coming out, frequently motivated by ethnic or racial issues, as in this case, that isn't said. For that, we must also admit that nothing is definitive yet in Russia. This is a small thing that happened, and we can build a large edifice out of what it means. But it's an interesting thing that happened.
And it's also the protest that just happened that looked like they're anti-Putin was just one set of protests where the Russia for Russian protests and the nationalist protests have been happening every single week. And they've been growing in number to where you're seeing 50,000 people on the streets versus 15,000 of the anti-Putin group.
It's very interesting selectively what is covered in Russia by the Western media. And it's things that comfortably fit into the vision of what ought to be happening. The more uncomfortable realities are not viewed at, and this election is really the case.
Now, let's just conclude by talking about an anniversary. It's almost 20 years to the week since the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Now Putin is saying he'll build a Eurasian Union with former Soviet republics. Is this an achievable policy goal, given both the economic cost and the pushback from those who have tasted freedom?
Well, I'm not sure that there's an economic cost or that large. From Putin's point of view, the failure of the Soviet Union really consisted of the fact that Moscow guaranteed the economic interests of all of the constituent republics. And huge amounts of money were flowing out from the center to these constituent republics. This union guarantees nothing. This union does not guarantee that Moscow is going to underwrite anything that the Ukrainians need or the Belarusians or so on. It simply says that they're going to be aligned. So this is very different from the Soviet Union. Is it doable? Yes, it's doable in part because Europe is collapsing and because any hope on the part of Ukrainians or anyone else that they're going to get into the EU in any meaningful time period has gone away. And so, whereas in a country like the Ukraine, where Europe, however distant, appeared to be an option, you're suddenly living in a world where that's not an option. Your options are limited, and in the end, they center around your old partner and not particularly good friend, the Russians. So the real question is, one, is it going to cost the Russians anything? I think they'll profit from it. Second, will it be possible? I think there's very little alternative for many of these nations.
And it's already rolling as well. This next year, we're going to see a very important step to create this Eurasia Union. The customs unions are going to start to become a new organization. And it's also going to start expanding from being just Russia with Belarus and Kazakhstan to also start taking in quite a few other former Soviet states. So the ball's rolling on this.
Lauren Goodrich and George Friedman, thank you very much for your insights on Russia. I'm Colin Chapman. That's Agenda for this week. Thanks for being with us.